What is a great jazz musician? Well, I guess you could say someone who plays jazz really well, but I mean, like, cutting through the music, what is it that they actually do? I would suggest two things. A jazz musician worthy of the name is essentially a storyteller and a conversationalist. Let's start with storyteller. First, what makes a great story? Well, it has to have a logical beginning, middle, and end, and it sustains your interest the whole way through. Also, there is a point to the story. It isn't just a succession of unrelated events. Everything that happens fits within a broader narrative framework. And finally, it's succinct. Or at least, it doesn't ramble on beyond its welcome. And that, in so many words, is precisely what a great jazz solo should strive to be. A jazz musician is an improvisatory storyteller. Now, why get into all of this? Well, I think jazzers tend to conflate attributes of a great jazz musician with the actual purpose of a jazz musician. You know, in an early account of the life of the Buddha, there was a story where Buddha was with a group of his followers, and he raised his hand and pointed way up to the moon. When he did, he noticed something. Half of his followers were indeed looking at the moon, but the other half were transfixed on his finger. Those staring at his finger were totally missing the point. The finger isn't really the noteworthy thing here. The Buddha was just using it as a means to point to something greater, namely the glorious radiance of the moon. But for some, that idea didn't really register, so they continued to stare utterly perplexed at his finger. Now, listening to jazz musicians today, many have become understandably distracted. Jazz truly is amazing. It's beautiful, the evocative sounds and textures, the complexity of it. No wonder jazzers love it so much. And thus, many think the point of jazz is to merely display a mastery of jazz, by being harmonically complex, melodically inventive, stylistically original, boundary-pushing, avant-garde, whatever. Now, these often are necessary traits of a great jazz musician, but they are only attributes. If they are not in the service of a balanced, great musical story, you have confused the finger pointing to the moon and fetishized the finger. Your solo will always reveal what you prioritize. Are you continuing in the great jazz tradition of marvelous storytellers, or are you just fascinated with demonstrating your mastery of virtuoso riffing? You know, for a period of time, I was involved in reading academic published articles, and it became painfully obvious to me there are really two types of scholars. Those sincerely trying to express themselves as clearly and meaningfully as possible, and those just honestly trying to use big words in an attempt to impress their colleagues. Kind of the same thing here. Telling a succinct musical story, if you will, one that has a beginning, middle, and end, a central climax, and is engaging the whole way through, and is in general concise, is infinitely more impressive than, quote, playing complex jazz. But here's where it gets interesting. What is the relationship between complex experimental virtuoso soloing and storytelling? Well, often, the former is a perfect way to compensate for a deficiency in the latter. You see, deep down, many jazz soloists are very insecure about the real meaning behind their solos. Sometimes, they don't even know what they're trying to express themselves. Complexity and virtuosity are perfect ways to mask a talented jazz soloist who lacks a clear vision of his art. Judge a jazz musician for what all the truly great jazz musicians were: superb storytellers. The other thing that a jazz musician must be is a great conversationalist. When I was younger, I used to watch a show called Whose Line Is It Anyway? It was a weekly show where the actors had to carry out a number of completely improvised skits. Now, the thing I think people realize about improvisational comedy that they don't apply so much to improvisational music is that there's just an understanding that in comedy, the improv has to be relational. That is to say, on Whose Line, the actors just didn't need to be funny. Their humor had to perpetually feed off of one another. They couldn't just talk past one another. Their humor constantly had to be an outgrowth of what the other members were saying. So as much as they may have wanted to go into their own little world and think of clever things to say, they had to listen to each other to carry out the skit. In group-based improvisational comedy, nothing else really works. You can't just have four guys telling unrelated jokes. It has to be a perpetually collaborative effort. Now, the greatest thing about jazz, the thing that really makes it shine above other genres of music, is precisely this: the dynamic that exists between musicians in dialogue. On Whose Line, both Colin Mochrie and Ryan Stiles were both fan favorites. But something magical happened when they were paired together. The chemistry just worked. They both went from being funny to hilarious. Both comedians had this odd capacity to bring out the best elements of each other, something that they just couldn't do as individuals. The problem, though, is that many jazz musicians today are so worried about sounding good and establishing their own brand, they don't listen, or at least not as much as they should, to the musicians around them. They become islands unto themselves, avoiding the whole conversational element of jazz, which is at its heart what the music is really all about. You know, it kind of reminds me of that nervous guy who walks up to talk to a girl, and as soon as she starts talking, he immediately stops listening to her, because he frantically needs to plan out in his mind what to say next, to avoid any awkward pauses. What savvy jazzers realize is that it's actually easier to be a good listener because then the onus is off you to be perpetually original. Only so many answers lie within. Most will be coming from those around you. The irony is, jazz actually has very little to do with jazz. It has to do with storytelling and conversation. The intellectual side of jazz, the harmony and the theory, is just used to breathe ever more meaning into the stories themselves. It's like learning a language. You don't learn a language just so you can use big, impressive words. You use it to converse more precisely with others. Jazzers should keep an eye on their developing virtuosity because often it stands in direct relationship to their development as a storyteller. If you aren't telling compelling musical stories, you will often try to compensate with ever crazier chord changes, endless choruses of melodic noodling, and pseudo-intellectual theoretical ideas. For a young jazz musician today, never forget your goal. It's to become a storyteller and a conversationalist. Never conflate the finger pointing to the moon.